A boy ran away on the coldest night of New Year's Eve, clutching a tattered notebook as his last link to his parents. When a despised beggar crossed his path and reached out, something unexpected emerged in the silence of the snow. But who was that beggar, and why did his eyes seem to know the pain the boy carried? On that night of unlikely encounters, decisions made in the freezing snow would lead to revelations no one could have foreseen. How far would they go to change their fates?
Snow fell in heavy flakes, covering Bridgetown with a white blanket that concealed the silence and melancholy of the small town. Inside a modest house, with walls that bore the weight of years, Jack, only 11 years old, sat on the cold kitchen floor, surrounded by boxes and old papers that exuded a faint smell of dust and nostalgia. He pulled out one by one the notebooks his grandmother had left behind, items that, for his mother, Helen, felt more like a burden than cherished memories. Helen entered through the door, shaking off the snow from her coat and carelessly hanging it on the back of a chair. Her face was tired, and her expression, marked by deep dark circles, revealed more than just physical exhaustion. It was the weight of sleepless nights, hard work as a waitress, and most importantly, the recent separation from Walter, Jack's father. She cast a brief glance at her son, who was so absorbed in one of the notebooks that he seemed oblivious to the cold air seeping through the half-open door. "Jack, what are you doing down there? It's cold on the floor," Helen said, trying to sound concerned, but her voice came off more like a warning. Jack didn't respond immediately. His fingers traced the yellowed pages of a notebook filled with careful handwriting. There were detailed notes on family recipes, small comments in the margins that seemed like secrets and personal touches. On one page, he found something that made his eyes light up. The phrase was there almost lost among doodles, "For when you are all together again." He read it aloud, as if it were a spell capable of changing the world. Helen, who was heating water on the stove, paused for a moment. The silence between them was almost palpable, broken only by the sound of the water boiling. "Where did you find that?" Helen asked, now more tense, turning to face the boy. Jack lifted his eyes from the notebook, holding it as if it were a precious treasure. "In the box Grandma left. Look, Mom, she wrote this here. I think we can make her recipes again. Maybe Dad will like it." The word Dad was like a spark, igniting an unspoken tension. Helen took a deep breath, feeling a familiar pain spread in her chest. "Jack, no. We've talked about this. Things aren't that simple." Her voice carried a tone of weariness and firmness. "But Mom, we always did this on New Year's. Remember the stew Dad loved? And the cookies you made with me? We can try again. Maybe he'll come back just for one night." Jack spoke with the urgency of someone who believes that love can overcome any barrier. Helen, on the other hand, could not afford to believe that. "He's not coming back, Jack," she said, trying to be as gentle as possible. "Things have changed. There's no use pretending we're still a family." Her voice faltered slightly, but she masked it by looking out the window, where the snow was falling relentlessly. Jack fell silent, clutching the notebook to his chest. He felt the weight of his mother's words, but something inside him refused to accept it. He could still hear his father's laughter echoing through the house, could smell the stew they all shared around the table on the last New Year they spent together. That memory felt more real to him than any justification his mother might give. "Just because you two fought doesn't mean we can't try again," he whispered, more to himself than to Helen. But she heard him, and that was like a blow. Helen turned, tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she held them back with the strength of someone who had already cried too much. "Jack, go to your room. Please." Her tone was final. She knew she couldn't allow space for discussions that would end up hurting them both. Jack hesitated, but seeing his mother's expression, he obeyed. He carried the notebook with him, climbing the creaky wooden steps. Once in his room, he sat on the bed, still holding the notebook tightly. He opened it again, running his fingers over the pages as if each recipe were a map to restore something that was lost. The phrase, "for when you are all together again," seemed to shine brighter each time he read it. Jack couldn't sleep. As the snow continued to fall outside, an idea began to form in his mind. If his mother couldn't or didn't want to try, then he would. He knew the dish his father loved most, remembered the ingredients. He didn't have much money, but he had enough to buy something. If he could prepare the special stew, maybe that would be enough to bring his dad back, at least for that night. He got up from the bed, opened a small metal box where he kept his savings, and counted the coins. A few quarters, some smaller coins. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He pocketed them and started putting on his thickest coat. As he descended the stairs, he tried not to make noise. Helen was in the living room, staring into space while a slow, melancholic song played on the radio. He knew that if she saw him leaving, she would stop his plan. Jack quietly opened the front door, the cold hitting him like a slap to the face. He pulled the hood over his head, closed the door behind him, and began to walk. The snow felt heavier now, blanketing the streets in an almost eerie silence. The streetlights cast long shadows on the white ground, and Jack felt a chill that came from more than just the cold. But he pressed on, with the notebook firmly under his arm. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he had a clear goal: to get the ingredients, prepare the dish, and bring his father back. The coins in his pocket felt heavier with each step, and the weight of the snow on his shoulders was like the burden of responsibility he had decided to take on. As he walked, the town seemed to transform. The shops were closed or nearing closing time, and the few passers-by hurried to escape the cold, with Jack merely a shadow amidst the vast white. With each step, his determination grew. He knew it would be difficult, but deep down, he believed that this effort could reignite something in his family. He didn't know exactly how, but he believed. And that belief was the only thing keeping him warm on that frigid night. The wind picked up, and Jack pulled his coat tighter around his body. He knew he couldn't turn back now, and deep down he felt that this journey was just the beginning. The snow was falling thicker by the minute, piling up on the sidewalks and covering the streets of Bridgetown like a blanket that muffled all sounds. Jack clutched his notebook against his chest, feeling the cold slice through his face like invisible knives. The lights in the shop windows flickered intermittently, creating a dance of shadows that seemed to amplify the loneliness of the nearly deserted streets. He knew he didn't have much time. The stores were closing, and the weight of the coins in his pocket served as a constant reminder that his resources were as limited as his chances of success with his plan. Jack walked quickly, his feet sinking into the snow as he scanned the area, trying to avoid being noticed. He knew his mother would be furious if she found out about his secret outing, but that was a risk he was willing to take. All he wanted was to bring his family together, even if just for one night. His grandmother's words from the notebook still echoed in his mind, "For when you are all together again." It was a promise he had decided to turn into reality, even if no one else believed in it. The first grocery store he came across had its lights off, the doors already locked. Jack pressed his face against the fogged glass, trying to see inside. The shelves appeared full of the supplies he needed, but they were out of reach. He moved on, the cold wind whistling in his ears, and spotted another store at the corner. This time, the lights were on, but an employee was hastily closing the doors. Jack ran towards it, his heart racing. "Wait, please!" he shouted, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. The employee, a middle-aged man with a tired face, hesitated for a moment before looking at the boy. "We're closed, kid. Come back tomorrow morning." "I can't wait!" Jack pleaded, pulling the coins from his pocket and extending them as proof of his seriousness. "I just need a few things, please, it's important." The man shook his head, clearly torn between compassion and the desire to end his shift. "I can't do anything now, kid. It's late. Go home before you catch a cold." Jack stepped back, feeling tears form in his eyes, but he held them back. He couldn't give up. Walking back to the main street, he noticed the shadows of people huddled under the awnings, trying to shield themselves from the cold. They were homeless, wrapped in dirty blankets, their faces almost invisible beneath their hoods. One of them lifted his eyes as Jack passed, but the boy looked away, feeling a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The night seemed full of stories he would never understand. As he crossed a dimly lit street, the sound of a police car made his heart race. He turned slowly and saw the vehicle approaching, its lights flashing in a nearly hypnotic pattern against the snow. The car stopped beside him, and an officer got out, adjusting his scarf as he walked toward the boy. "What are you doing out here alone at this hour, kid?" the man asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. Jack tried to hide the notebook behind his body, feeling his nerves rise. I'm going to buy something for my mom," he lied, trying to sound confident. "She needs some ingredients for dinner." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Your mom sent you out in this storm? And where is she now?" Jack hesitated, realizing his story didn't make much sense. "She's busy. Working." He looked down at his own feet, the cold seeping through his thin boots. "I just want to help her." The officer sighed, rubbing his hands to warm them. He looked around, as if assessing the situation, but before he could ask more questions, the radio in his car emitted a shrill sound. A voice announced an emergency in another part of the city, and the officer, after a moment's hesitation, said, "Go home, kid. Now. And don't let me catch you wandering around here again." Jack nodded quickly, watching as the officer got back in the car and drove away, the lights fading into the fog. He took a deep breath, relieved, but the fear still lingered. However, he knew he couldn't go home empty-handed. He tightened his coat around his body and continued walking. As he turned another corner, he slipped on a frozen puddle and fell to his knees in the snow. The notebook flew from his hands, landing a few meters ahead. Jack quickly got up, brushing his hands off and running to retrieve the precious item. But before he could reach it, a hand appeared and picked it up. "You seem to be in a hurry," said a deep but gentle voice. Jack looked up and saw a middle-aged man dressed in worn clothes and a coat that was too large for him. His face was weathered, but his eyes held a kindness that surprised the boy. "Thank you," Jack said, taking the notebook back but not taking his eyes off the man. He realized this was one of the homeless people he had seen before, but something about him felt different. "What are you doing out here alone on a night like this?" the man asked, tilting his head. Jack hesitated but eventually decided to share part of the truth. "I'm trying to get some ingredients for New Year's dinner." The man looked at him for a moment as if trying to grasp what that meant. Then, to Jack's surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. "It's not much, but it should help," he said, extending his hand. Jack was taken aback. "You're going to give me this? But you need it more than I do." "Maybe," the man replied with a sad smile, "but it seems like what you're trying to do is more important, and everyone needs a little help sometimes." Jack took the coins with gratitude, feeling a wave of warmth wash over him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to. Just make it count," the man said, putting his hands in his pockets and stepping back. "If you need anything else, I'll be around." Jack watched him disappear into the darkness, feeling a mix of curiosity and admiration. There was something about that man that felt different, as if he understood Jack's pain and hope in a way no one else could. With the notebook and coins firmly in hand, Jack prepared to continue his journey. The wind picked up and the snow seemed to whisper secrets in the night as the boy moved forward, sensing that something bigger was about to happen.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more people who love emotional stories like this. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's continue with the story.
The snow fell incessantly, creating a dense layer that made Jack's steps feel even heavier. George walked beside him, slightly hunched against the cold, but with a look of determination that contrasted with his worn clothes and weathered face. Jack followed him in silence, trying to keep pace with the older man. Each step seemed to bring the boy closer to his goal, even though he wasn't quite sure if he would succeed. "I know a grocery store that might still be open," George said, pointing toward the end of the poorly lit street. "The owner is an old acquaintance, but I'm not sure he'll be too happy to see me." Jack looked at George, intrigued, but decided not to ask any more questions for now. The man seemed to carry an invisible weight, something that made him hesitate before talking about himself. The grocery store soon came into view, its lights still lit and a sign flickering intermittently. Jack felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was still time. As they approached, George hesitated before opening the door. He looked at Jack as if silently asking him to stay calm. As soon as they entered, the bell above the door echoed through the space, and a man with graying hair and keen eyes appeared behind the counter. Upon seeing George, his expression changed instantly. He crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "George, it's been a while since you've shown up around here. I thought you'd disappeared for good," the man said, his tone a mix of surprise and distrust. George took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Good evening, Arthur. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to help this kid here." Arthur looked at Jack, noticing the notebook he held so carefully. His eyes returned to George, assessing the situation. "What's going on?" "He needs some ingredients," George replied. "It's a long story, but he's trying to prepare something important." Arthur scoffed, uncrossing his arms. "Important, huh? Like the promises you used to make? And the debts you never paid?" His tone was sharp, and Jack looked at George with curiosity and concern. "I know I've made mistakes," George admitted, looking down. "But I'm not asking for myself this time. It's for him." He pointed to Jack, whose anxious expression seemed to soften Arthur's attitude a bit. The silence that followed was tense. Arthur rubbed his chin, thoughtful, before finally sighing. He moved to the back of the store, gathering some vegetables, potatoes, and small packets of seasonings. "This is all I can give you," he said, placing the items in a bag, "and only because it's for the kid. But this is your last chance, George. Don't come looking for me again." George nodded, carefully taking the bag. "Thank you, Arthur. You have no idea how much this means." As they left the grocery store, Jack couldn't contain his curiosity. What did he mean by last chance? What happened between you two? George fell silent for a moment, watching the snowflakes fall under the nearest streetlight. "Sometimes we make bad decisions when we're desperate. Arthur helped me in the past, and I didn't know how to repay him." He looked at Jack with a faint smile. "But that doesn't matter now. Let's keep going. Let's keep." On the other side of town, Helen was arriving home, exhausted after a long shift at work. The cold seemed to have frozen her to the bone, and all she wanted was to collapse on the couch and close her eyes. But as soon as she opened the door and noticed the unusual silence, something inside her stirred. She called for Jack, but received no response. She rushed up the stairs, entering the boy's room, where she found the empty space and Jack's notebook was missing. Helen's heart raced. She tried to rationalize the situation, thinking that Jack might be nearby, but reality began to sink in. He wasn't home, and his thicker coat was gone too. She hurried down the stairs, grabbing the phone with trembling hands. She called Walter, even though she knew he rarely answered. "Come on, Walter, answer," she murmured, pacing back and forth. But the call went to voicemail. Helen felt a mix of anger and panic. How could she have let this happen? Maybe she had ignored Jack's feelings too much, thinking he was just a kid who would forget the pain over time. Helen put on her own coat and stepped outside, determined to look for her son. The snow continued to fall, making the streets even more deserted. She stopped at the gate, unsure where to begin. Guilt gnawed at her mind. If something happened to Jack, she would never forgive herself. Meanwhile, Jack and George had found temporary shelter in an abandoned warehouse where other homeless people were seeking refuge from the cold. The place was dark and damp, but it offered some relief from the biting wind. George placed the bag with the ingredients in a corner and turned on a small lantern he carried. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," George said, trying to sound optimistic. Jack looked around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. There were few people there, all huddled in blankets and sleeping bags. The silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional howl of the wind outside. Sitting on the floor, Jack finally felt he could open up. He told George about his parents, how the divorce had shattered the family's harmony, and about his plan to bring everyone together for New Year's dinner. George listened intently, nodding from time to time. "You're a brave kid," he said after a long silence. "Few people have that kind of determination, especially when the world around them seems so difficult." "I just want them to be happy again," Jack replied, looking at the notebook in his hands. "If I can do that, maybe things will go back to how they were before." George sighed, resting his hands on his knees. "I understand what it's like to want things to go back to the way they were, but sometimes we can't change what happened. We can only try to find a new path." Jack looked at him with curiosity. "Did you ever have a family?" George hesitated, his eyes growing distant. "I did. A long time ago." He didn't say anything more, but Jack sensed that the memory seemed to hurt more than he was willing to admit. As the cold intensified and the snow piled up outside, Jack heard George murmur something while looking down at the floor. He couldn't quite make it out, but one word stood out: Brown. Jack furrowed his brow. That was his father's last name. He wanted to ask more, but George got up and walked over to the bag, as if wanting to change the subject. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day," George said, draping a blanket over Jack before settling into a corner. Jack closed his eyes, but his mind kept spinning. What did George know about his father? And why did he seem so reluctant to talk about it? The blizzard outside intensified, and the warehouse was now almost completely surrounded by snow. The wind howled like a distant warning, but to Jack, it was just the beginning of something much greater than he could ever imagine. The morning arrived slowly and gray, with the weak sunlight barely filtering through the cracks in the ceiling of the warehouse. Jack woke up first, wrapped in an old blanket George had given him. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and took in his surroundings. The place was silent, except for the occasional cough from some of the other homeless people. There was something different about the atmosphere. Despite the cold, the precariousness, and the musty smell, Jack noticed a certain solidarity in the silent gestures of the people around him. A woman, her face marked by time and suffering, was sharing a piece of bread with a younger man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. In another corner, someone was adjusting the blanket of a sleeping neighbor, ensuring he was protected from the cold seeping through the cracks. Even at his young age, Jack felt something transforming within him. He began to understand the harshness of this reality, and how those small acts of humanity kept people standing, even amidst adversity. George, sitting near Jack, had been awake for some time, watching the boy with a thoughtful look. He held a metal mug with hot tea that someone had distributed earlier. When Jack noticed him, George smiled faintly, though his face carried a shadow of sadness. "How are you feeling?" George asked, handing the mug to Jack. I think I'm okay," the boy replied, holding the mug carefully. He took a sip and looked at George, waiting for him to say something more. George sighed, as if gathering the courage to speak. "You know, Jack, life wasn't always like this for me. I had a home, a family, even a good job. He paused, staring at the ground. "I worked for years in a factory here in the city. It was honest work, but things changed. They started making cuts, and I was one of the first to be let go." Jack listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the man before him. George seemed to be reliving each moment as he spoke. "After that, I tried to find another job, but doors seemed to close before I could even knock. The little I had saved ran out quickly, and the worst part was the pride." He clenched his hands as if trying to hold on to something invisible. "I had friends who could have helped me, but I couldn't ask. I couldn't admit that I was failing." Jack felt a tightening in his chest. He had never thought that someone like George, someone who seemed so distant from his own life, could have gone through something so painful. "And your family?" the boy asked, his voice low. George shook his head. "They drifted away. Or maybe it was me who pushed them away. I don't know anymore." He paused again, hesitating before continuing. "I worked with a man at the factory. His name was Brown. He was a good guy, always tried to help where he could. But by the time I needed help, I was so consumed by shame that even he didn't know what was happening." Jack froze upon hearing the name. "Brown? What was he like?" George looked up at the boy, noticing the sudden interest in his voice. "He was a hard-working, dedicated man. Had a family, I think. Why?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. It wasn't their phone, but rather an invisible connection in the narrative. Across the city, Helen had finally managed to get in touch with Walter. She held the cell phone tightly, pacing back and forth in her living room as his voice echoed from the other end of the line. "How could you let our son go out alone on a night like this?" Walter accused, clearly irritated. "He's only 11 years old, Helen." "Do you think I knew he was going out?" she retorted, her voice trembling with anger and worry. "If you had been more present, maybe he wouldn't feel so alone." The tension on the call was palpable. Both were overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, concern for Jack and the weight of old grievances. Walter took a deep breath. "Do you think he went looking for me?" Helen hesitated. It was possible, but she didn't want to admit that maybe Jack had sought out his father for something she couldn't provide. "I don't know, Walter. All I know is he's not home, and the city is under a snowstorm. We need to find him." "I'll head out now," Walter said, putting on his coat. "But where do I start? He could be anywhere." Helen didn't respond immediately. Her mind was flooded with memories. The fights that led to their divorce, the lonely nights when Jack asked about his father, the times she felt lost herself. "Start downtown," she finally suggested. "I'll check the outskirts." Walter left the house, the snow falling around him, each step echoing the urgency he felt. He knew the relationship between him and Helen was complicated, but at that moment, all that mattered was finding Jack. Back at the warehouse, Jack finally found the courage to continue the conversation. He looked at George with wide eyes. "My dad's name is Walter Brown, too. Do you think... could he be the same one you knew?" George froze for a moment, as if trying to process what he had just heard. He set the mug down and looked at Jack with a shocked expression. "Your father? Walter Brown?" Jack nodded, feeling his heart race. "Yes, do you think it's him?" George ran a hand over his face, clearly shaken. "It could be. I never knew much about him outside of work. But if it's the same man, I owe him more than I can explain." "What do you mean?" Jack asked, leaning forward. George hesitated, struggling against memories that seemed to come rushing back. "He tried to help me. Back when everything was falling apart, he tried. But I was so lost that I couldn't accept it. And by the time I finally needed him, it was too late. I distanced myself before he could realize how far I was falling." Jack felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was shocked to discover this unexpected connection between George and his father. On the other, he felt a pang of sadness hearing George's story. He knew his father carried regrets too, even though he rarely spoke of them. The snow continued to fall outside, and the warehouse felt even colder as night deepened. Jack looked at George, realizing that this man was not just a stranger. He was a piece of a larger puzzle, something that could help bring together the fragments of his own family. George, on the other hand, seemed to be closing himself off again. He stood up and began to tidy up the little they had, as if wanting to avoid more questions. "It's best we rest. Tomorrow we'll see what we can do." Jack nodded, though his mind was racing with questions. He knew that this story was still incomplete. As he wrapped himself in the blanket and tried to sleep, he couldn't stop thinking about how George and his father were connected and how this could change everything. The wind outside howled as if whispering secrets that still needed to be revealed. And in that precarious warehouse, under the weight of an unrelenting snowstorm, Jack felt he was just beginning to understand the true complexity of what it meant to have family, regret, and redemption. The cold was relentless, and the warehouse where Jack and George were felt more like a frozen trap than a refuge. The boy trembled slightly, clutching his grandmother's recipe book as he looked at the ingredients they had managed to gather. Even though he was just a kid, he knew cooking in this place was impossible. The snow outside was beginning to seep through the cracks, making the environment even more hostile. "We can't do this here," Jack said, his voice firm but tinged with concern. He looked up at George, who was sitting in the corner, rubbing his hands to keep warm. George sighed, realizing the obvious. "You're right. We need a place with a real kitchen. I know somewhere, but—" He paused, hesitating for a moment as if the idea made him uncomfortable. "Where?" Jack asked, eager. "A church," George replied. "They have a community kitchen that they sometimes let people use. The priest is an old acquaintance. Maybe he can help us." Jack nodded immediately. There was no time to hesitate. They gathered their few belongings and braved the snowstorm once more, the snowflakes whipping against their faces like tiny shards of ice. The church was a few blocks away, but each step felt like a greater challenge than the last. When they finally arrived, the dim lights inside the building felt like a promise of warmth and welcome. George pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the sound echoed through the silent space. The interior was simple yet inviting. Wooden benches were lined up in rows, and candles lit around the altar cast a soft, comforting glow. A tall man with gray hair and dark robes approached them, wearing a smile that seemed to blend surprise and suspicion. "George," the priest said, his voice full of kindness, "it's been a long time. I haven't seen you since, well, a long time." George gave a faint smile, shrugging slightly. "Yeah, Father, it's complicated. But I didn't come to ask for myself this time. This is Jack. He needs help." The priest looked at Jack, assessing the boy with a warm gaze. "And what do you need, Jack?" I need a place to cook," Jack replied, holding the recipe book as if it were a shield. "It's really important." The priest raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but eventually nodded. "Cooking, huh? Well, I suppose the kitchen is available. Just ask that you keep everything clean." Jack smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Father. That means a lot." As they made their way to the small kitchen in the basement, George walked in silence, visibly uncomfortable. Jack noticed the tension, but decided not to press him. Upon reaching the space, they turned on the lights, revealing a simple yet functional area. There was a stove, a sink, and some pots hanging on the wall. It was more than enough. As they organized the ingredients, Jack began to lose himself in his memories. He recalled being in his home kitchen with his mother and father, laughing and helping to prepare his grandmother's special stew. He could almost hear his father's laughter as he tried to sneak a piece of meat from the pot, only to be scolded by Helen. Those memories filled him with determination. He knew that if he could recreate that moment, he might be able to bring back the lost harmony of his family. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Other homeless individuals began to appear in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of the ingredients being prepared. Jack felt everyone's eyes on him, and the tension in the room was palpable. A thin man, wearing tattered clothes and a wary expression, was the first to speak. "George, what are you doing? You brought a kid here? This could cause problems for all of us." Jack flinched slightly, but George stepped forward, placing himself between the boy and the others. "He just wants to cook something. He's not going to cause any trouble." "It's not safe," insisted the man, crossing his arms. "What if the police show up? Or worse, what if they call someone from child services? You don't think about anyone but yourself, George?" "That's not true," protested Jack, his voice loud and clear. He stepped forward, meeting the adults' gazes with a courage that surprised even him. "I need his help. That's why we're here. I just want to bring my family back together. And he's helping me." The silence that followed was nearly unbearable. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the boy, who took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. Finally, the priest entered the kitchen wearing a calm yet firm expression. "That's enough," he said, looking at the homeless individuals. "Jack is just a child, and if George has decided to help him, it's not up to you to judge. This is a place of welcome, not confrontation." Reluctantly, the others stepped back, murmuring among themselves, but they did not interfere again. Jack looked at George, who seemed more relieved than grateful. "Thank you," the boy said, feeling a new wave of respect for the man who accompanied him. As they continued preparing the ingredients, George remained silent for a long time, as if fighting an internal battle. Finally, he sighed and broke the silence. "You know, Jack, I think you deserve to know something." Jack stopped what he was doing, looking at George with attention. "What?" George fidgeted with his coat pocket, as if seeking comfort in an automatic gesture. "I already told you I knew your dad, but what I didn't mention is how things really ended between us. He tried to help me when I lost my job, offered me a way out, a chance to start over. But I was so ashamed that I turned him down. Not just turned him down, but pushed him completely away. I never gave him a chance to insist." Jack fell silent, absorbing every word. He could imagine his father trying to help George, but he also knew Walter wasn't the type to insist when someone said no. "Do you think he knows you're here? That you live like this?" Jack asked, his voice low and almost fearful. George shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. Walter, he was a good man, but maybe he's forgotten about me, just like I tried to forget him. Or maybe he tried to look for me, but I was already too far gone." Jack felt a pang of anger, something he hadn't expected. How could his father have let someone like George fall so low? But at the same time, he understood it wasn't that simple. People can't save others who don't want to be saved. "I'm going to talk to him," Jack said suddenly, his voice filled with determination. "When he comes, I'll tell him everything." George looked at the boy with a mix of surprise and sadness. "It might be too late for that, Jack." "No, it's not," Jack insisted. "It's never too late." Silence fell over them again, but this time it was different. There was a sense of resolution, that both had decided to move forward despite the weight of the past. As the aroma of the ingredients began to fill the small kitchen, Jack looked at George and saw more than a homeless man. He saw someone who, like him, was trying to find a way back to something lost. Outside, the snowstorm continued, blanketing the city in white. But inside the church, there was a spark of warmth and hope. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt he was closer to achieving what he had always wanted, bringing his family together and perhaps healing wounds none of them knew they had. The scent of stew began to fill the small church kitchen, mingling with the stifling heat of the boiling pots. Jack watched George with growing admiration. The man moved with an unexpected skill, his calloused hands chopping the vegetables with precision, while stirring the thick broth with a wooden spoon. With each movement, he seemed more at ease, as if he were reclaiming something lost in his past. "You cook really well," Jack said, breaking the silence. He leaned over the counter, trying to get a better look at what George was doing. George smiled slightly, but there was a shadow in his gaze. "It was something I used to do with my family. My wife, she loved this kind of simple food, the kind that warms the soul. I learned more out of necessity than talent." Jack fell silent for a moment, absorbing the information. He didn't know much about George's past, but he was beginning to realize that the man carried a more complex story than he let on. "Do you miss them?" Jack asked, not taking his eyes off the pot. George paused, stirring the broth for a moment, as if the question had struck something deep. "Every day," he replied finally. "But sometimes missing someone isn't enough to bring them back." Jack understood what he meant, but he refused to accept that it was true for his own family. He believed there was still time, that the stew could be the first step toward healing the wounds between his parents. Maybe you can find them again. If I can bring my family together, maybe you can too." George didn't respond, but the look he cast at the boy was filled with admiration. There was a determination in Jack that he hadn't seen in a long time, something that made him want to believe again, even if just for a brief moment. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Helen was at her wits' end. After a series of frustrating calls and vague answers, she finally got a solid lead. A police officer informed her that Jack had been seen near a grocery store in the city center. She quickly thanked him and rushed out, feeling the urgency increase with each step. Helen barely noticed the cold as she walked through the snow-covered streets. Her heavy coat was a physical shield, but nothing seemed capable of protecting her heart from the rising fear. The images of Jack alone in the storm, lost and vulnerable, wouldn't leave her mind. With every corner she turned, a new wave of guilt washed over her. How had she let this happen? When she arrived at the grocery store, she found the owner, Arthur, closing up for the night. He confirmed that he had seen Jack a few hours earlier, accompanied by a man he described as suspicious. Helen felt her stomach twist. Who was this man? What did he want with her son? "Did he seem dangerous?" Helen asked, trying to keep the panic from showing. Arthur shrugged. "Can't say. He didn't look threatening, but he wasn't someone I would trust easily." They left and headed toward the west side. Helen knew the west side of the city was less populated, filled with abandoned buildings and small shelters. She thanked Arthur and hurried in the indicated direction, her heart racing faster. In the church, the atmosphere was far from calm. As the stew neared readiness, the kitchen door burst open and Arthur entered, his face serious and suspicious. He shot a direct look at George, who was standing next to Jack. "I knew you'd bring trouble," Arthur said, pointing a finger at George. "I thought you had learned to stay away from problems." George straightened up, maintaining his composure. "We're not causing trouble, Arthur. We're just using the kitchen." "And what if something goes missing?" Arthur countered. "What if the police come because of this? You know how complicated it can make my life." Before George could respond, the priest entered the kitchen, placing himself between the two. "Arthur, this isn't necessary. George and Jack are here with my permission. No one is causing harm to anyone." Arthur hesitated, his gaze flicking between the priest and George. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. But this is on you, Father. If anything goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you." Once Arthur left, Jack looked at George, concerned. "Has he always been like this with you?" George gave a humorless smile. "Arthur has his reasons. I can't blame him." Time seemed to pass faster than Jack would have liked. He glanced at the clock on the wall and realized there was less than an hour until midnight. The stew was almost ready, but he knew the real challenge still lay ahead, bringing his parents to the church. It was then that George, seemingly thinking the same thing, picked up an old phone from the corner of the kitchen. "I'm going to call your dad," he said, with a seriousness that made Jack hold his breath. "Do you think he'll answer?" Jack asked, his eyes wide. "I don't know," George replied, dialing the number with trembling fingers, "but we need to try." The line rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Walter," George said, his voice firm but loaded with emotion. It's George." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Walter finally responded, his voice was cold. "George, what do you want?" "It's not about me," George said quickly. "It's about Jack. He's here at the church. He's trying to do something important. You need to come." Walter hesitated. "Why are you with my son? What's going on?" "I can't explain right now," George replied. "I can only say that he needs you, and that maybe you need him more than you realize." Walter was silent again, but George could hear his heavy breathing. Finally, Walter said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. George placed the phone back on the hook and looked at Jack. "He's coming." Jack smiled, but there was a nervousness in his eyes. "And my mom? How will she know?" "If she's looking for you, it won't be long before she finds us," George said. He put a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Now, let's finish this. Are you ready?" Jack nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. As the stew finished cooking, he knew the moment of truth was approaching. Outside, the snow continued to fall, as if covering the city in a silence filled with expectations. And in the small church kitchen, a boy and a broken man were about to achieve something greater than they could imagine.
Before we dive back into the story, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support makes a huge difference for the growth of this channel. Thank you for being here. Let's get back to the story.
The snow piled up outside the small church, like a cloak that muffled sounds and froze any hesitation. Inside, the aroma of stew filled the community kitchen, warm and comforting, yet it did nothing to ease the growing tension. Jack finished organizing the last details while George stood silently beside him, seeming to carry an invisible weight. The sound of the church door bursting open echoed throughout the space, and hurried footsteps broke the silence. Jack looked up and saw his mother, Helen, appearing in the corridor. Her expression was a mix of relief and anger, her red-rimmed eyes shining with concern as she saw her son. "Jack!" she shouted, rushing toward him and enveloping him in a tight embrace. "My God, where have you been? I was so worried!" Her voice trembled, and tears began to stream down her face. "I'm fine, Mom," Jack said, hugging her back. I just wanted to do something special." Helen pulled back slightly, holding Jack's face in her hands and examining him as if she needed to make sure he was really there, whole and healthy. It was then that her eyes fell on George. Her expression immediately shifted, becoming cold and distrustful. "Who is he?" Helen asked, standing up straight and instinctively placing Jack behind her. "What is he doing here?" "Mom, he helped me," Jack replied quickly, feeling the tension rise. "I was cold and he gave me a place to stay. He even got ingredients for the stew." Helen looked at George with narrowed eyes, assessing him from head to toe. "Is that so?" Her voice was heavy with doubt. "And why would you do that?" George opened his mouth to respond, but Jack spoke up first. "Because he's a good person, Mom. He hasn't done anything wrong." Helen crossed her arms, clearly uncomfortable. "I appreciate that you helped my son, but that doesn't change the fact that he should never have left home, and you shouldn't have encouraged him to stay here." "Mom, it wasn't like that," Jack said, frustration rising. "I left because I wanted to do something important. He was just trying to help me." Helen took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger that threatened to spill over. She shot another distrustful glance at George, who remained silent, as if he knew that anything he said would only worsen the situation. Before the conversation could continue, the kitchen door swung open and Walter walked in. He was out of breath, clearly having come straight from the cold, and his expression was a mix of relief and confusion. His eyes immediately found Jack's, but before he could say anything, he noticed Helen and George. "You?" Walter said, pointing at George in disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" "Walter," Helen began, but he interrupted her, his voice filled with anger. "What is he doing here? After everything that happened, you're associating with him?" Walter stepped forward, his face reddening with each word. "I'm not associating with anyone," Helen replied, her voice rising. "I came to get our son." "And found him with George," Walter retorted, gesturing dramatically. "The man who disappeared years ago without a word. And now he's here as if nothing ever happened?" George stepped forward but hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, Walter. I just—" "Trouble?" Walter interrupted, laughing without humor. "You've always been trouble, George. Always relying on everyone but never around when someone needed you." "That's not fair," said Helen, now defending George, though her posture was still tense. "He helped Jack. That's what matters right now." Walter turned to her, his eyes shining with frustration. "And you? Why did you let Jack leave home? Why did he feel he needed to do something like this? You've always been so caught up in your own pain that you didn't even see what was happening to him." "Don't you dare blame me for this!" Helen shouted, her anger finally boiling over. "I do everything I can to take care of him while you hide behind your work and your guilt." "Guilt?" Walter laughed again, but his voice was bitter. "Should I feel guilty for trying to support you, who has always had to handle everything alone while you—" "Enough!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking with tears. "Stop fighting!" Silence fell in the kitchen. Helen and Walter looked at their son, who now had tears streaming down his face. Jack trembled, not from the cold, but from the pain of seeing his parents hurl accusations at each other like strangers. "I just wanted us to be happy again," he said, sobbing. "Why can't you stop fighting, even for a moment?" George, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. He looked at Jack, then at Helen and Walter. "This is my fault," he said, his voice trembling. I should have done more. I should have asked for help." Walter turned to him, confused. "What are you talking about?" George swallowed hard, the words coming out with difficulty. "When I lost everything, I knew you would have helped me, Walter, but I was so ashamed. I couldn't admit that I needed you. So I disappeared. I thought that if no one saw me fail, I would still have some dignity." Walter fell silent, his face hardening as he absorbed the words. George continued, now with tears in his eyes. "I didn't reach out because I was scared. Scared that you would judge me, scared that you would see what I had become, and in doing that, I betrayed you. I betrayed our friendship." Helen, who had been silent during George's confession, looked away, as if his words struck her personally. She crossed her arms but said nothing. "I'm so sorry," George said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything, but if there's anything I've learned, it's that it's never too late to try to fix things, even if it seems impossible." Walter looked at George, then at Jack, and finally at Helen. He saw the reflection of his own mistakes in George's confession, the moments he should have said something, done something, but chose silence or distance instead. "Do you think you're the only one who failed, George?" he finally said. "I failed too. And not just with you." The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted. The aroma of the stew, which had been just a background detail, now seemed to fill the space with something deeper, a sense of memory and hope. Jack wiped his tears, looking at his parents and George. "Can we please stop talking about the past just for today? Helen stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're right. she said, softening her voice. "For today, we can try." Walter nodded, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. He looked at George, then at Helen, and finally smiled, albeit hesitantly. "Looks like we have something to share before the year ends." George carefully took the pot and placed it on the table. Jack, with a small smile, grabbed his grandmother's notebook and placed it next to the pot, a silent reminder of where it all began. As the clock approached midnight, the four of them sat around the makeshift table. The smell of the stew enveloped them, bringing back memories and perhaps the possibility of something new. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the small kitchen there was warmth, not just from the stove, but from something that felt harder to grasp, a spark of reconciliation. The aroma of the stew hung in the air, filling the modest community kitchen of the church with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the relentless cold outside. Jack nervously glanced at his parents, who stood rigidly, visibly tense, as if any movement could trigger another argument. He clutched his grandmother's recipe book against his chest, seeking courage to say what he had been rehearsing in his mind. "Please," Jack said, his voice small yet full of determination. "Can you just sit and try what we made? It's New Year's, just today for me." Helen and Walter exchanged glances, both hesitant, but Jack's plea carried a weight they couldn't ignore. George, standing beside the boy, broke the silence with a gentle tone. "He worked hard to make this happen. I think he deserves for you to try it." Helen took a deep breath, running a hand through her hair, while Walter, arms crossed, finally relented with a slight nod. "All right," he said, "just for today." The table was improvised with a small bench and a simple tablecloth, and Jack placed the pot of stew in the center as if it were a trophy. George helped serve, his experienced hands carefully placing each portion on the plates. Helen and Walter sat on opposite sides of the table, their movements hesitant, reflecting the still heavy atmosphere of unresolved pain and silence. Jack pulled up a chair and sat between them, his face alight with hope that this gesture could be the first step toward something greater. George remained standing, watching, but not intervening. The priest entered quietly, standing off to the side like a silent guardian of the scene. Helen carefully took the spoon, stirring the stew before bringing a small portion to her mouth. At the same moment, Walter did the same. The silence that followed was heavy, but there was something different in the air. Both closed their eyes for a brief moment, as if the flavor had the power to transport them to another time. It was impossible not to remember past New Year's spent together in their home kitchen when life seemed simpler. Helen found herself back in those happy moments, Jack running around the living room with the energy of a small child, while Walter helped her prepare the dishes. The taste of the stew was the same, and for a moment, everything felt frozen in the past. Helen opened her eyes, and a tear silently rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but Jack noticed. "Is it good?" he asked anxiously. "It's great," Helen replied, her voice breaking. She looked at her son, trying to smile, but the weight of everything they had lost was hard to ignore. Walter, in turn, placed his hand on Jack's shoulder. "You did a good job, son," he said, with a tone of regret that didn't go unnoticed. It was as if, with those words, he was acknowledging that he hadn't been the present father Jack deserved. Jack smiled, feeling enveloped by the small moment of truce that seemed to be forming. The atmosphere, once cold and hostile, began to warm with simple gestures and contained words. George watched in silence, clearly moved, but maintaining his discreet posture. The priest, sensing the delicacy of the situation, stepped forward and suggested, "Perhaps you two could talk a bit. Just the two of you. Jack and George can finish tidying up the kitchen while you chat." Helen and Walter looked at each other, as if considering the idea. Jack looked at his mother and then at his father, silently pleading for them to accept. Finally, Helen nodded. "All right," she said. "I think we can try." Walter stood up, gesturing that the conversation should take place elsewhere. Helen followed him to a more secluded corner of the room, where they sat side by side, but still with a distance that reflected the unhealed wounds between them. Jack and George remained in the kitchen, gathering the plates and cleaning the counters. Jack couldn't stop glancing at his parents, trying to catch any sign of progress. "Do you think they'll stop fighting?" he whispered. "It's not something that changes overnight," George replied, setting a pot aside. "But sometimes all we need is a beginning." On the other side of the room, Helen stared at her hands while Walter gazed at the floor. The silence between them was nearly unbearable, but finally Helen broke it. "I don't know how we got to this point," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "I feel like we've failed with Jack, with ourselves, with—" Walter took a deep breath, finally lifting his eyes to meet hers. "Maybe we have failed," he admitted. "But blaming each other isn't going to change that. It's only going to make it worse." Helen nodded, fighting against the emotion that threatened to overflow. "I just want him to be happy, to feel like he has a family, even if we can't fix everything." "He still has a family," Walter said, his voice softer. "Both of us. No matter what happened between us, he is what matters now." They remained silent for a moment, but there was something different. It wasn't a complete resolution, but a spark of understanding. They looked at each other, not as ex-husband and ex-wife, but as parents trying to do the best for their son. The clock on the wall marked the final minutes before midnight. Helen and Walter returned to the table, where Jack and George had finished tidying up. The atmosphere now felt lighter, as if the weight they had carried for so long was starting to lift, even if slowly. "Did you talk?" Jack asked, hopeful. Helen looked at her son and smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Yes, we talked." Walter placed his hand on Jack's shoulder again. "And we'll keep talking, son. I promise." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, as if something had finally changed. He looked at George, who gave him a slight nod, as if to say that the worst was already behind them. As the church bells announced the arrival of the new year, Helen, Walter, Jack, and George sat down at the table once more. There were no grand speeches or unrealistic promises, just the quiet sound of a new beginning that they all knew they would need to build together. The snow continued to fall outside the church, covering the world in an almost absolute silence, while inside the warm walls, Walter and Helen sat in a more isolated corner, facing each other. The tension between them was almost palpable, but the quiet around them seemed to offer a rare opportunity, a moment to lower their defenses. Walter leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Remember when everything was simpler?" He laughed, but it was an empty laugh. "When the biggest problem was deciding who would do the dishes after dinner." Helen crossed her arms, looking down at the floor. "It's hard to remember those things when the fights have erased almost all of the good memories." She looked up at him, a mixture of pain and regret in her eyes. "But I think we both know it wasn't just that." Walter nodded, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know. It wasn't just the routine that wore us down. It was the things we never said, the things we kept bottled up until they exploded." Helen sighed deeply, pressing her hands against her arms. "I blamed you for so long, Walter. For everything, for every late bill, for every night you came home late. But I never thought about how hard you were trying to hold everything together on your own." "And I blamed you," Walter admitted, his voice lower now. "For not understanding the pressure I was feeling, for pulling away when I just needed a moment to breathe." Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't as oppressive. It was more of a void that needed to be filled, a pause to absorb everything that was being said. Helen broke the silence, her voice choked. "You know what's worse? We were both so busy fighting that we forgot to pay attention to Jack, to see what he needed." Walter closed his eyes, the image of Jack braving the cold to prepare that dinner flashing through his mind. "He tried to pick up the pieces we broke," he said. "While we were both busy blaming each other, he was trying to save us." Helen brought her hand to her face, wiping away a tear that escaped. "He's stronger than I ever imagined, stronger than both of us." The mention of Jack seemed to create a bridge between them, something they both could understand and respect. Walter hesitantly reached out, touching Helen's arm. "I can't change the past, Helen, but maybe we can do better from now on. For Jack." Helen looked at him, the barrier of resentment she had carried for so long beginning to dissolve. "I want to try," she said, a small smile forming. "Even if it's hard." Walter slowly moved closer, wrapping her in an awkward but meaningful embrace. They both cried silently, the tears washing away years of accumulated pain. It wasn't a total forgiveness, but it was the beginning of something that could grow. However, the moment was abruptly interrupted when the kitchen door swung open forcefully, and Arthur, the owner of the grocery store, entered once more. His expression was stiff, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something wrong. "I knew this was going to be a problem," he said, crossing his arms. "You're still here? I should call the police. This place is not a shelter for the whole night." Walter and Helen pulled away from each other, both tense, as Arthur continued to complain. "And you, George," he said, pointing a finger. "How many times are you going to take advantage of people's kindness before you finally give something back?" Before George could respond, the priest intervened, emerging from the back of the room with impressive calm. "Arthur," he said in a firm but peaceful tone, "today is New Year's. It's not a night to kick people out. It's a night to renew hopes." Arthur hesitated, his posture relaxing a bit at the priest's words, but he still looked irritated. "I hope this renewal includes paying off debts," he said with a bitter tone. Jack, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward, facing the grocery store owner with determination. "Sir," he said, his voice clear and strong, "we just wanted a New Year's dinner. I just wanted my parents to be together at least for one night. That's why we did all of this." Arthur looked at the boy, his hardened expression beginning to soften. "You crossed that snowstorm, just for this?" Jack nodded. "I wanted them to remember how it was before everything went wrong, and George helped me. He didn't do anything wrong." Arthur looked at George, then at the priest, and finally at Jack. He sighed, rubbing his forehead as if he was tired. "You have guts, kid," he said finally. "More guts than many adults I know." The silence that followed was filled with a sense of relief. Arthur stepped back, shaking his head. "All right," he said. "I won't call anyone, but you can't stay here all night." "Then take us," Jack said quickly. "You have a car, don't you?" Arthur was surprised by the proposal, but after a moment he nodded. "Okay, I can take you, but just this once." The relief was palpable on everyone's faces, especially Jack's. Helen placed her hand on her son's shoulder, a light smile appearing on her face. Walter reached out to George, who hesitated before shaking his hand. "Thank you," Walter said sincerely, "for helping my son." George shook his head. "It was him who helped me, more than you can imagine." As everyone prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the room felt different. It wasn't perfect, nor completely resolved, but there was something new. An increasing unity, a silent promise that what had been broken could perhaps be rebuilt. Arthur waited patiently as everyone climbed into the car, the snow still falling heavily outside. Jack sat between his parents, a hopeful smile on his face. He knew that this night wasn't the end of their problems, but it was undoubtedly the beginning of something better, and that was all he needed. The atmosphere in the community kitchen of the church had changed completely. What was once filled with tension and uncertainty was now saturated with calm and relief. Jack, Helen, Walter, and George were gathered around the table, collecting the dishes and cleaning up the remnants of the dinner that, improbably, had managed to bring everyone together. Outside, the distant sound of fireworks began to echo, marking the arrival of a new year. Jack smiled as he gathered the cutlery, moving with renewed energy. Helen and Walter, though still cautious, spoke in a softer tone, exchanging occasional comments about the stew and the unexpected evening that had led them here. George, however, sat quietly in a chair in the corner of the room. He watched the group with a mix of happiness and discomfort, clearly feeling like an intruder. "George," Helen said, breaking the silence, "why don't you stay a little longer? We can brew some coffee." George looked up in surprise, hesitating before responding. "I don't want to be a bother. I think I've taken up enough space for one night." "You're not bothering anyone," Helen insisted with a small smile. "In fact, I think we have a lot to be thankful for." Walter, who was sitting next to her, added, "She's right. You've done so much for Jack. That's not something I can ignore." George lowered his head, nervously fiddling with his hands. "I just did what any decent person would do." Jack, who had overheard the conversation, interrupted eagerly. "No, George, you did so much more. Without you, none of this would have happened." The relaxed atmosphere began to take hold of the room. Helen placed the coffee pot on the stove, and the smell of fresh coffee soon mingled with the aroma that the stew had left in the air. As they waited, Walter looked over at George, who still seemed out of place. "You know," he started casually but sincerely, "the old factory is still running. They always need someone for maintenance or simple work. Maybe I can talk to someone over there." George raised his eyes, surprised. "You'd do that for me?" Walter shrugged. "You've done a lot, and everyone deserves a second chance." George smiled, but his eyes were misty. He didn't respond immediately, but the sparkle in his gaze spoke more than words. When the coffee was served, the group sat down at the table again, this time without any tension. They talked about New Year's memories, laughing at old stories and imagining what the future might hold. The sound of fireworks grew closer, and Jack ran to the window, marveling at the colorful bursts of light in the sky. "Happy New Year!" he shouted, turning to the others with a radiant smile. Helen and Walter exchanged a meaningful glance. Despite everything they had been through, there was something in Jack's enthusiasm that made everything seem a bit simpler, a bit more possible. They stood up and walked over to him, each placing a hand on their son's shoulders. "Happy New Year, Jack," Walter said warmly. Helen looked at Walter and, after a moment of hesitation, gave him a brief hug. Walter returned it, and both smiled, albeit a little shyly. George watched the scene from afar, his eyes misty as he tried to contain his emotion. For him, that small gesture meant more than any words. "Thank you," Walter said, turning to George, "for taking care of my son, and for reminding us what really matters." Helen nodded. "Yes, George. Thank you. This evening could have been very different without you." George swallowed hard, nodding. "I just did what needed to be done, but thank you." The evening continued in a tranquility that felt surreal to everyone. When they finally decided it was time to leave, the group bid farewell to the priest, who wished them a happy new year with a warm smile. Helen, Walter, Jack, and George stepped out together into the cold morning air, snowflakes still gently falling. The next morning, the story was already spreading. A resident who had witnessed part of the reunion at the church had posted on social media about the boy who brought his parents together on New Year's Eve and saved the life of a man experiencing homelessness. The words were accompanied by a photo discreetly taken through the church window. Jack, Helen, Walter, and George sitting around the makeshift table, sharing the meal. The post quickly gained traction, touching the hearts of people throughout the city. Comments and supportive messages began pouring in, wishing the group a new beginning filled with hope. The small church, once just another discreet spot in the city, had become a symbol of renewal and kindness. As the world outside reacted to the story, Jack found George sitting on the church steps, watching the first light of day break through the thick clouds. He approached silently and sat beside him. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, looking at the man who had become so important in such a short time. George smiled faintly, but tears were streaming down his face. "I'm okay, Jack. Better than I've been in years." Jack waited for him to continue, and after a moment, George finally spoke. "You know, what you did, bringing your family together, gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" Jack asked, curious. "Courage," George replied, looking toward the horizon. "Courage to dream again. Who knows? Maybe one day I can find my own way back." Jack didn't respond, but he placed his hand over George's, offering silent comfort. They sat there, watching the sunrise in a moment of deep connection that transcended words. When they returned inside the church, Helen and Walter were waiting for them with gentle expressions. "George," Helen said, hesitating for a moment before continuing, "you don't have to leave. You can stay with us, at least for a while." Walter nodded, supporting the suggestion. "Yeah, we have space, and it's the least we can do." George looked lost for a moment, but then he smiled, tears returning. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Jack immediately hugged him, and Helen and Walter joined the embrace, creating a moment of unity that had seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. The dinner, the reconciliation, and the promises made that night were not just symbolic gestures. They were the beginning of something real, a new chance to build a life with fewer regrets and more hope. As the daylight filled the church, the small group knew there was still much work to be done. But for the first time, they believed they were on the right path. The New Year's dinner had not been just a meal. It had been the rebirth of faith in love, forgiveness, and the ability to start anew, and that was all they needed to move forward.
The early morning light softly illuminated the snow, a reminder that even on the coldest nights, hope can emerge from the most unexpected places. Jack, his parents, and George showed us that forgiveness, unity, and empathy are stronger than any adversity. The New Year's Eve dinner wasn't just a meal, but a rebirth, a testament that it's never too late to rebuild bonds and turn pain into new opportunities. What lessons can we take from this story? Are we capable of forgiving and starting over, even when the past seems to hold us back? And what did you think of this journey? Share your thoughts in the comments about this moving story. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Leave a like and share your reflections in the comments. Your engagement greatly helps the growth of this channel. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video by clicking the end card on your screen. Thank you for being here and being part of this journey with us. See you in the next story.